Well, good afternoon, everyone. I have 301. I want to take this time to thank you for joining our monthly VOAD training for Maine VOAD. Just a couple things, some housekeeping items. This session is being recorded. You will see some transcripts there, so we are trying to make this presentation available to VOAD members that aren't able to attend today. At the same time, again, I know you're busy, and I do want to take time to thank you for attending today. Today we have James Segerson as the FEMA Region 1 Individual Assistance Officer, Emergency Management Specialist from the IA branch of FEMA Region 1. We're privileged to have here today. Next month's session will be ICS for VOAD, and we're kind of focus on how VOAD would be the framework that would be used for a response. So we're going to actually talk a little bit more specific to VOAD and ICS and how it applies, whether at the EOC or an incident scene. So look forward to that presentation coming up. We have more training sessions coming up. We're actually getting ready to release the new schedule for early part of 2024. It's hard to imagine we're almost there. So every quarter we'll update our schedule. Again, all the scheduling is subject on the availability of the presenters, particularly if we get into some weather activities like hurricanes and things like that, or other disasters. So with that, it's my privilege to turn this over to James Segerson, who is the FEMA Region 1 IA, and he will talk about an individual assistance in disasters. So James, welcome.
All right. Thanks very much, Bill. I appreciate you inviting me to join the call and talk a little bit about FEMA's individual assistance program. I'm just going to get my slides up here. Hopefully everyone can see those.
Can everybody see those?
Yeah, they look great.
Great. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Perfect. So as Bill said, my name is James Segerson. I'm a member of the FEMA Region 1 Individual Assistance Team. So we support the 6 New England states and sort of help to manage and administer individual assistance. And Bill asked me to come on today, join the call, and talk a little bit about, what we do, what programs we offer during a federally declared disaster, and kind of how our process works. One of the things about Region 1 is we tend to have a lot of public assistance disaster declarations. So public assistance is the side of recovery that focuses a lot more on, public infrastructure. FEMA provides grants and funds for repairing public infrastructure and things of that nature. We don't typically see as many individual assistance declarations, which is a good thing. I mean, obviously, we don't want to see that scale of disaster in our region, but it also means that sometimes we're not as familiar with what IA programs are out there and what we have to offer. And really, individual assistance, what it boils down to is providing support and sort of the initial pieces that folks need for recovery at the individual and household levels. We're really focused on the household level, providing various different types of programs and supports to help people on their path to recovery following a disaster event. I'm going to talk very briefly about just kind of some of the laws and regulations that govern our programs. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, or the Stafford Act for short. This is where FEMA gets our legal authority and responsibilities to conduct disaster assistance following a federal declaration. And that's one of the key parts that I want to mention here, is that a lot of our assistance, for better or worse, is sort of, locked behind that declaration wall. So we need to get that federal declaration or an emergency declaration before much of our assistance becomes available. Not all of our assistance, but many of our programs become available following that federal disaster declaration. And just kind of showing you here the different tiers. The Stafford Act is that overarching legal authority that FEMA has to conduct disaster assistance following an event. Then we have the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, That provides the regulatory guidance to FEMA for how we administer our programs. And then finally, we have the Individual Assistance Program and Policy Guide, or IAPPG for short, which provides that specific agency guidance for what programs we offer, the eligibility criteria for those programs, and how they would be administered during an event. For anyone interested, all of these documents are available publicly. We have a link here to the IAPPG. You can also just search, FEMA Individual Assistance Program and Policy Guide, and it'll pop up on a search bar if you're interested in taking a closer look at what that document entails. I'm not going to say it's an exciting read, but it is available for anyone that's interested in learning a little bit more about our programs. So we'll jump right into our programs here. And I said before that some of our programs are available at different points or different phases in a disaster. When we're in that sort of initial response phase, or even pre-impact phase, if we're looking at something like a coastal storm or another notice event, we do have some assistance available even before a declaration has been made. Typically, it's sort of at the coordination and situational awareness level, particularly with mass care and emergency assistance, and even with the work some of our VALs do, or our voluntary agency liaisons. For Region 1, I'm sure you all are familiar with John Stewart and Katie Brayshaw. There are 2 Region 1 VALs, and they work with various VOAD partners during steady states, during disaster events, to kind of coordinate activities and share situational awareness for what are the needs and what is everyone doing, and try to coordinate those efforts to provide services most effectively. But a lot of the individual assistance programs come into play after a major disaster declaration. That includes our individuals and households program, community services programs, and then of course we kind of go a full 360, and toward the end of the recovery we really go back and rely on the VOAD partners and the work that our VALs do to look at those long-term recovery needs and unmet needs in affected communities. So this graphic here just shows kind of a step-by-step picture of what the disaster declaration process looks like. And I wanted to show this because I've talked a lot about the requirement for a federal disaster declaration to bring in some of our IA programs. And so I wanted to just share what that looks like. So once an event occurs, the state's going to be working with local jurisdictions, sometimes even with VOAD partners, to collect initial damage estimates about what the impact was. From there, they can determine if they'd like to request what we call a joint preliminary damage assessment, which is when FEMA teams would actually come in to sort of validate that initial damage estimate and work with the state on kind of firming up what those numbers look like. So that's where we go and we look at the severity of impact to homes, how widespread the damage is. We kind of classify homes based on different damage criteria, ranging from those that may have not been affected all the way up to those that were completely destroyed by the event. Based on the results of that, the state can decide whether they'd like to request a formal disaster declaration, which comes in the form of a letter from the governor that goes to the FEMA regional office, and then it goes through a series of reviews and recommendation processes, going all the way up eventually to the White House, where a decision will be made on whether or not the declaration will be approved or not. But you can see that there are a lot of steps in this process. And typically when we have an event where a declaration request is being issued, everyone involved really wants to get this process moving quickly, so that we can get programs in place and assistance to people as fast as possible. So it's really key that when we get to this phase, all the stakeholders involved work together to kind of quickly assess the damage, get the required pieces in place so that we can get that declaration request moving through the approval process. In this next graphic here, it might be a little hard to read some of the text on your screen, But I wanted to show this as it's a good visual representation of the typical disaster assistance sequence of delivery. It just shows kind of the order in which we typically see, at least from the federal side, where the different pieces of disaster assistance come into play. And again, it all starts with the work that, local and state agencies and voluntary agencies do in that initial response phase. And typically those mass care services, right? Feeding, sheltering, and so forth. The other really critical piece that comes at the forefront of the recovery process is insurance. Are the people that have been affected by the event insured? If they are, that's typically going to be their best avenue for recovery, is to go through that insurance process and get their damages reimbursed that way. Unfortunately, we know that not everyone is insured, or not everyone has the right type or adequate amount of insurance to cover all of the damage they may have experienced during an event. So that's where we kind of come into play. A lot of the FEMA programs are designed to provide assistance to folks who either are not insured or who are underinsured. So they have damages that their insurance didn't completely cover. So as far as FEMA programs go, once that declaration has been issued and a person has registered for FEMA, the first grouping of programs that they'll be assessed for eligibility are FEMA housing assistance programs. So that's things like if they've been displaced, did they have to pay for a hotel out of pocket? Well, if they did, perhaps we can reimburse their expenses for that. We may be able to give them rental assistance if they've had to move into a new apartment, or repair assistance if they're looking at a lot of work on their home to get that back up to a livable standard. So the housing assistance piece is the first thing that we look at when we go through a registration to assess eligibility for our various programs. Once they've been assessed for housing assistance, then we move on to what we call other needs assistance, or ONA for short. And that can be things like, funeral assistance if they had a family member who passed away as a direct result of the disaster. It could be medical, dental expenses, childcare, things of that nature, maybe not directly related to their housing, but that were still affected as a direct result of the disaster. From there, we actually work very closely with the Small Business Administration, or SBA, and we refer FEMA registrants to the SBA to determine if they may be eligible for a low interest disaster loan. Registrants they're not required to take an SBA loan. I know a lot of people, hear that they don't want to take out a loan to fund the cost of repairs and things of that nature. That's completely understandable. But we do refer folks to the SBA if they're interested in that option. The SBA, they'll go through their own criteria. If an individual is found eligible for an SBA loan, they can get up to $200,000 for real property, so repairs to their home, and up to $40,000 for personal property, replacing things that were damaged. If folks aren't eligible for an SBA loan, then they can come back to FEMA, and we may have a few additional programs available, providing some funds for personal property, transportation, and things of that nature. Once they've gone through, that entire process, again, that's not going to address all the needs of some of the folks that were affected by a disaster, unfortunately. So at the very end, we come back to oftentimes, the different VOAD partners and unmet needs task forces that have been established, often with the support of our FEMA voluntary agency liaisons, to try to address any lingering or unmet needs that folks may have, even after they've gone through this entire process of what federal programs might be available. All right, so looking a little more closely at the mass care and emergency assistance piece, one of our big roles, FEMA's big roles in this area, is the Emergency Support Function 6 desk, or staffing that at our Regional Response Coordination Center. We sort of co-lead the ESF6 function with the American Red Cross during an activation. And that's where we can help to coordinate all the various mass care and emergency assistance activities that are going on in an affected state or states during a disaster. So a lot of times those efforts are still going to be state-led, the state really driving the service delivery that's going on the ground. Where FEMA can come in as far as mass care support is coordinating the involvement of different federal agencies like the USDA, for example, or the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. We can bring in those federal assets. We can provide direct federal support in the way of supplies. If a state needs additional sheltering supplies, cots, blankets, pillows, or meals, whether shelf-stable meals or potentially activating some federal contracts for partners that can come in and provide hot meals for survivors. Those are types of things that we can support with mass care. Really, it's when the state's capabilities have been exceeded, we can look at what we can do to bring in additional resources to help offset that. Another big piece of what FEMA can do as far as mass care is the Transitional Sheltering Assistance, or TSA for short. Now, this is not necessarily included with every declaration. There is a separate request after an IA declaration has been issued. A separate request does have to be submitted by the state for TSA to be activated. But essentially what this is a FEMA-managed non-congregate sheltering program that's once approved, FEMA can turn on a network of participating hotels that eligible FEMA registrants can then basically check into and stay in while they're kind of figuring out the next steps and longer term solutions for their recovery. It is FEMA managed, so once it's turned on, we'll work on communicating available hotels to those registrants. We'll be in touch with the registrants about their eligibility and what their next steps are, and how they can extend their stay if necessary, and if they are eligible to do so. But we don't offer wraparound services with TSA. So in other words, if folks are staying in a TSA shelter, FEMA is not necessarily going to do things like coordinate meal delivery to those individuals or do comprehensive case management for those individuals. So there still needs to be some coordination with different service providers as needed to provide some of those services if folks require them. Then we get to our next piece here, which is our FEMA voluntary agency liaisons. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with this role, being VOAD partners. But essentially our VALs, our FEMA VALs, serve as a link to you all. Working with VOAD partners, again, during building relationships during steady states and helping to coordinate VOAD activity, during a disaster event. A lot of what we do as FEMA and what the VALs do with the VOAD partners is situational awareness. It's what are the needs and who is providing what services in what locations, and that helps to paint a bigger and more comprehensive picture of what a disaster event and an operation looks like, so that we can help fill any gaps as needed. One of the other big things that our VALs do is help to coordinate donations management or unsolicited donations. They do a lot of work with either matching donors who want to provide in-kind donations to where the need is, or helping to provide subject matter expertise on how to manage unsolicited donations, because I think as we all know, that can turn into a very heavy lift logistically if we get a lot of incoming unsolicited donations. Our VALs are experts in how to manage that. So then we get into some of the activity and the programs that get turned on after a disaster declaration has been issued. Disaster survivor assistance isn't a program per se, but it is an activity that we conduct following a declaration. Our DSA teams are teams of either FEMA staff. Sometimes we use AmeriCorps teams to go out, and they serve as sort of our boots on the ground in a disaster area in the immediate, aftermath of an event in a federal declaration. They'll help the FEMA leadership team to kind of gather on the ground information of, what do things look like on the ground? Where are really severely hit areas? Are there any particularly vulnerable pockets of impacted population that we should be looking at? They can also do on the spot registrations for folks. So if they're canvassing a neighborhood and happen to run into homeowners, our DSA teams can help those folks register, right then and there for FEMA assistance, so they can get that process started. We often see DSA teams requested to staff things like MARCs, multi-agency resource centers. If those are being stood up and FEMA presence is requested, we can often send a DSA team so they can do on-site registrations and provide information to folks about available FEMA programs and so forth. One of the other activities we conduct shortly after a declaration is the establishment of FEMA disaster recovery centers, or DRCs. These are physical locations that we would work with the state on identifying where and when they would be established. And then FEMA would staff them with our applicant services folks. We'd staff them with hazard mitigation folks. Small business administration would be there. And they serve as a physical spot where people can come to either register with FEMA for assistance, to get more information about what we're able to offer for this particular event, and for really just to be a presence in the affected communities, a physical presence. Even though we see that typically the majority of registrations occur either online or by phone, we still find it important to have that physical presence in affected communities that people can come to ask questions or get the support that they need. So these are opened up very quickly after a federal declaration. And once they are open, again, these are FEMA managed facilities. Sometimes we will also invite VOAD partners to come and staff these as well. That doesn't occur with every DRC at every event, but depending on the need of the affected communities, we may see some of that sort of co-location of, the FEMA SBA teams at DRCs along with some VOAD partners. And then just a quick snapshot of some of the different FEMA programs that can be available. It's important to note that, not all IA programs are available for every disaster. Some of them, like TSA or like disaster case management that you see there on screen, do require sort of an additional layer of approval following a declaration. So a lot of the programs available are tailored to the specific event based on the needs of the affected population and what the state has requested from FEMA. So the individual and households program, it's split into two different pieces. We have the housing assistance program and the other needs assistance program. But combined, really the intent of IHP is to provide financial assistance to folks who have had direct losses related to the disaster, whether that's damage to their home, damage to their personal property. We can provide that financial assistance through IHP to help those folks on their way to recovery. But it is critically important to note that this is not a replacement for insurance. There are caps on the amount of assistance that we can provide to people. So it's very likely that they may have damages exceeding the amount of financial assistance we can provide. So it's one of the things that we really try to push anytime that we're engaging with partners or with community members during steady state, is that FEMA assistance, while it can be substantial, it can only go so far, and it's not a replacement for things like insurance. So for fiscal year 2023, There's a maximum of up to $82,000 in assistance that FEMA can provide to any one applicant through the individual and households program, and that's split halfway between what we can provide for housing assistance and what we can provide for other needs assistance. So as I mentioned before, there is that maximum, and while $82,000 is a lot of money, it's not going to be enough necessarily to rebuild someone's home. So it's really, really important that we push that message that it's not a replacement for insurance, and that really is insurance is the best way that people can protect themselves from these types of events. And then just some general conditions of IHP eligibility. Typically, what will happen is folks will register with FEMA either through our website, by calling us through a DRC or interaction with a DSA team. Once they've registered, their case will be reviewed by FEMA staff, and they'll be notified if they need to provide any additional information for us to determine their eligibility, or they'll be notified that they have been found eligible or ineligible, and what the next steps may be there. But if there are ever any questions, if a person ever has questions about their eligibility, there's no harm in registering for FEMA assistance and then being found ineligible. So I always encourage people to register, go through the system, see if you're eligible for any assistance. And the worst that can happen is that you're found ineligible. And then very quickly, I want to talk about some of our community services programs that can be available following the disaster declaration. We have disaster case management, which some of you may be familiar with. This is a program where FEMA can provide grant funding to state, local, tribal, territorial partners, essentially to establish long-term disaster case management services after a federally declared event. So in this case, FEMA provides the funding. FEMA wouldn't actually be doing the case management, but can provide funding for a case management program to be established. One thing to note here is that the immediate disaster case management program that you see on the screen it's currently unavailable. It's being reworked. So I wanted to leave it on here because it is being reworked by our team at headquarters, and they're hoping to make that available again soon. But currently, the only DCM program available is the second bullet you see there, the Disaster Case Management Program Grant, which is the longer term program. We have crisis counseling as well, which is another grant program that we work with SAMHSA to administer. There's a lot of activity with crisis counseling in response to COVID. I think each one of our Region 1 states established a crisis counseling program. I know Maine had a very successful program. And essentially, FEMA's role in this is again, it's providing the funding, the grant funding for states to establish these programs. In the case of crisis counseling, it's to help with the psychological sort of first aid that folks may need following a disaster event. We also have disaster unemployment assistance. Again, so this is in partnership with the Department of Labor, where FEMA can provide unemployment assistance to folks who lost work as a direct result of the disaster, and also who are not eligible for any state unemployment assistance that's out there. And then lastly, we have disaster legal services. So this is where we work with the Young Lawyers Association to establish essentially a hotline that folks can call to receive free legal advice through the Young Lawyers Association. Sometimes they may be able to provide personnel to deploy to an event and for example, staff a DRC. But at the very least, we'll get a hotline set up so that if folks have legal questions or legal needs following a disaster events, they can call this line to get some free legal advice. And then just some additional links and resources folks are interested in learning more about FEMA individual assistance, or I'm happy to take any questions that you all may have.
Well, thank you, James. Does anybody have any questions for James?
I'll just thank him for his presentation. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Andrew. And Ann has a question.
Hey, James, I figured I'd go ahead and take advantage. Also, thank you, but I was wondering,
Sure.
Since you've been through this a few times with different states, IA declarations, and work with people through the IA process, do you have any recommendations for the state of Maine or our county directors on the call for really emphasizing the importance of insurance beforehand versus after a disaster hits?
Yeah, I wish I had a good answer to that. I think it's one of those things that I found, people typically don't put too much thought into it or pay too much attention to it until it's too late, right? It's been mostly my experience. I think that any chance that you all get at the state or county level to push household preparedness programs. I know that there are different, VOAD agencies out there that do household preparedness. I know that the Red Cross has some household preparedness programs. I think those are, they have a lot of excellent information in them. I think the trick is getting people to listen and commit the time to it before something happens. And I don't think that is something that we've found a great answer to, unfortunately. I think that if you have, social media teams that can push, different notes and sort of, snack sized tidbits of information, I think that can help too. It's easier for people to digest small pieces of information than maybe sit through like an hour-long presentation. But yeah, I would just say, communicate early and often and just try to get the message out there as much as possible.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Anybody else?
Hi, James. I'm Nikki. I run the 211 Maine program here in the state. I just wanted to thank you for your piece, especially around clarifying with individuals kind of the difference between the assistance with their insurance. I know at 211, when we've been activated to collect damage data, for instance, that's been an area of confusion for people. They think all because they've notified 211 and we're collecting with their permission, sharing that information back with the state, that everything's taken care of then. So I think that, like you said, the more we can clarify those, clarify and communicate those messages, the better.
Yeah, and it is tricky because, like you said, if people they're calling in to report damages prior to a declaration, right? Oftentimes we see that once they say, hey, I've got damages, this is what's happened. If there is a declaration issued after that, they are sometimes not aware that they still have to actually register for FEMA assistance, once the declaration has been issued. So it's a constant communication battle to try to just get the information out there. And, once there is a declaration, our FEMA PIOs will work, very closely with the states, kind of amplify messaging around that and make sure there's a coordinated voice of, what do people need to do? Where can they go to do it? We'll be sending out links, sending out phone numbers, DRC locations, all of that sort of thing. But it is typically a challenge in most, if not all, declarations.
Great questions. Anybody else? Well, James, I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank everybody who's on this presentation today, and hopefully, you've got some insight on some things. We talk about damage a lot, and a lot of times it's just the awareness. And I think the key message is preparedness is critical, not only in the idea of like we talk about preparing for a storm or other event, but the idea of understanding that insurance is really critical, making sure the insurance is adequate for your needs. The cost, things have gone up, but understanding there are some resources that may be available if something does happen in your state. So with that, James, thank you so much. And I hope everybody has a great afternoon.
All right. Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, James.
Thanks, James.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Bill.